Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, dear student. Thank you so much for joining tonight Global Seminar Series, the first inaugural session on energy and climate challenge in emerging Asian countries. We're so delighted to have three very top and senior scholars with us to share their insights on these issues. So the seminar series that highlights and discuss common climate change challenges across East Asian countries, as well as its difference between them, with the hope to enhance students' understanding via in-depth comparative analysis of the related issue and train your analytical and research skills. This session will introduce the relationship between economic growth, energy consumption, and greenhouse gas emission. In this light, we will also review the history of Asian economic emergence and what it has meant for global energy market and the GHG emissions. So I will be very delighted to introduce the moderator tonight and then hand it over to him to start the session officially. So the moderator tonight with us is Professor David Sandalow, our beloved scholars in this area who worked with us for many years to promote education and also research on energy areas on behalf of Columbia University in China. He is the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy and co-director of the Energy and Environment Concentration at SIPA. He funded and directs the Center US-China program and is author of Guide to Chinese Climate Policy. During fall 2019, he was a distinguished visiting professor in the Schwarzman Scholar Program at Tsinghua University. So now I'm very glad to hand it over to Professor Sandalow to start the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Helena. Greetings, everyone from around the world. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm delighted to be here and thank you for joining us for this inaugural session of the Global Seminar Series on Energy and Climate Policy in Emerging Asia. I want to thank Helen, I want to thank Xiaomo and Kaim for all your hard work pulling this together and Pierre Noël for his vision on this whole series. The goal of this series is to highlight and discuss the common climate and energy challenges across East Asia. And in this opening session, we're going to talk about economic growth, energy consumption, green recovery efforts around the world. So just a few housekeeping items to start. After the speakers talk, we're going to have a moderated discussion and we'll throw it open to questions from all of you. You can ask questions by using the Q&A function. Let me introduce our great speakers tonight. We have first Dr. Pierre Noël, who's a global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia. His research interests are at the intersection of international energy markets and public policy choices. He's worked on energy security policy in Europe with a special reference to Russia-dependent Central and Eastern European countries, and specializes in changing natural gas market structures and how they impact policy choices. Dr. Noël will speak first, and then he'll be followed by Laszlo Varro, who we're really honored is joining us today. He's the chief economist at the International Energy Agency, and therefore a global expert on the economics of energy. He's worked at the IEA since 2011. He became the agency's chief economist at the start of 2016, succeeding Fatih Birol, who took over as the IEA executive director that year. So with that, let me turn over the presentation to the microphone to Dr. Noël for a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much to all of those who worked hard to put this together. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on who you are, on where you are, sorry. Let me just share my screen and then we can get started. Okay, so bear in mind that this is the first of a series of 4 of those seminars, and the other 3 will have a focus on a country or region, namely China, India, and then Southeast Asia. So this was meant really to be an introductory session, and I appreciate there are people with very different backgrounds who have joined this session, and for some of you this might be very basic, and to those in that situation I apologize, but hopefully still a good way of putting on the table as we get started some of the fundamental issues that are driving this problem, and of course that are pointing to the solutions to this problem. So the very, very basics of essentially the physics behind the problem of climate change or global warming. I'm not a physicist, I'm just, this is why it's only the very basics. I just want to talk even superficially about things that I understand, at least superficially. But essentially, some energy is directed at Earth, the planet and Earth, from the sun. A proportion of it goes back up, and this proportion is brought down by the rise in concentration of greenhouse gases. So that's the greenhouse effect. We receive the same energy as we've always received, but less of it is reflected back to the atmosphere because it's trapped, so to speak, by greenhouse gases. Those greenhouse gases are not limited to CO2, but basically CO2 is, correct me, colleagues, if I'm wrong, but it's basically 2/3 of the problem. And most of that is the result of us burning fossil fuels, which have formed over millions of years, and we've discovered how to bring them to good use, at least good for us, human beings, at the Industrial Revolution, and we've been doing that ever since. So human activity increased the concentration of greenhouse gases, which in turn blocks the energy that comes from the sun, and or more of it, and therefore brings temperatures up. There's a very handy website that gives you the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere in real time. And yesterday it was 417 parts per million, which is a measure of concentration. And so we're at about, what is it, 1.5 times pre-industrial levels. And we are still rising, the concentrations are still rising very, very fast, as you can see. And the temperature anomalies are also increasing in line. So let's move to territories where I'm more comfortable. Where do the CO2 emissions come from in terms of geography, which of course is irrelevant to their impact on climate change, but where do they come from? And especially what's the role or the place, the impact of Asia, and especially emerging Asia. And this gives you the picture since, not exactly since the Second World War, but since the mid-1960s. And as you can see, the share of global emissions coming from Asia has been growing very, very fast. So emissions from Asian countries have been growing much faster than global emissions. And since year 2000, broadly speaking, nearly 100% of the growth in global emissions, not 100% of global emissions, but 100% of the growth in global emissions have come from Asian countries. China has played a very big part. We're going to dig deeper into this in the next of those sessions, of those seminars. but India is if not catching up with China, India's emissions are now rising faster than China's, and the rest of emerging Asia is also rising fast, including ASEAN, which we will also look at in more details. There has been a period of very rapid growth in Chinese emissions between early 2000s and late 2000s. A sort of plateau, and now it seems to be rising again, not at the same pace. So Asia has had a very important role in the global picture, very important region in the global CO2 emissions picture, and has been responsible for most of the growth since the beginning of this century. So why do energy-related emissions grow at all? So we can decompose that in two extremely simple equations. CO2 basically equals to GDP times CO2 divided by GDP, right? I mean, that's easy. And you can decompose each of those terms. So GDP can be decomposed into population times GDP per person. And CO2 divided by GDP can be decomposed in two components: energy divided by GDP and CO2 divided by energy. So the green component here is called energy intensity of GDP. It's the amount of energy that is embedded in 1 unit of economic output. And the red bit here is called the carbon intensity of energy. And the product of the two, which is equal to CO2 on GDP, is absolutely critical. So we're going to look at yellow, green, red rapidly to understand a bit better why Asia has become so central to the global emissions. The first of those factors, which is GDP decomposed into its drivers, population growth and GDP per person, the growth in economic output per person. Very simply, a very large share of the world's population growth during the time that we look at has come from Asia. And at the same time, the economic output per person in Asia has really skyrocketed to an extent that doesn't compare with any other region over that period in the world. There's been a lot of population growth in Africa, but there has not been anything like what has been going on in Asia in terms of increase in GDP per capita. And therefore, Asia has really become the driver of global GDP growth. So that's one of the, of course, explanations. And this is just another way of saying that Asia has really emerged, started to emerge for some countries economically. China has been a very important driver of this, with hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, living standards rising like never anywhere in history before. That's the global consequences of this. If we look at the other parameters, energy intensity of GDP, the amount of energy that is needed to generate a unit of economic output, and then the amount of carbon emissions or CO2 that is embedded in each unit of energy consumed, we see the following. There is a long-term convergence trend in terms of the energy intensity of GDP. So India has peaked at a low level in international comparison. ASEAN has perhaps peaked now, but very recently. And they both, depending on how we account for GDP, they both now are at the levels roughly of the rich countries on average. China still has a relatively higher energy intensity, but it has been going down dramatically. And we can see clearly this long-term trend of convergence. However, on the right-hand side of the slide, we can see that there are very significant differences in terms of CO2 intensity of energy. And energy consumed in Asia tends to be very carbon intensive. There's a lot of CO2 that is embedded in energy consumed in Asia. In international comparison, that's one thing. And the other thing is that apart from China, which is a very important exception, apart from China, it's actually not going down yet. So in India, the carbon intensity is roughly stable. And in ASEAN, it was stable and it actually started to rise again about a few years ago when as coal has been replacing a lot of natural gas in the region. In the rich world, the carbon intensity of energy is on a long-term trend of slow but steady decline. So you bring everything together. Asia, or emerging Asia, is the engine of global economic growth. It consumes, especially because of the importance of China, it consumes relatively a lot of energy or per unit of GDP generated. And that energy tends to be more carbon intensive, not only than rich countries, but than world average. So if you bring the three together, this really explains why Asia has become not only the driver, but actually explains nearly 100% of the growth in carbon emissions since the beginning of the century. Let's look very briefly at the future. Of course, living standards and economic output per person are still much lower on average in Asia than they are in the rich world. So there's still a lot of catch-up to be done. And then behind Asia, there are other regions, we're not going to talk about that, but other regions that also expect, and we can hope they do, catch up over time. And that's exactly why in the global climate change negotiations, at the very beginning, in the early 1990s, this concept of common but differentiated responsibility had been introduced, which means that the expectation was that rich countries would start cutting their emissions much earlier than emerging countries. And one of the things that I've discovered, looking at a lot of publications and data, is that this is probably no longer the case, because we've waited so long to start getting serious about the problem that now the carbon budget for 2 degrees is almost exhausted, and the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees, which is the even more ambitious one, is very close to be exhausted, which means that we will have to dash to zero almost all at the same time. And I think it's a very important question, because this actually changes somewhat the political and perhaps the technological dynamics or the expectations about emerging countries vis-a-vis the global efforts towards climate change mitigation. But keep that in mind. The budget being what it is, the cumulative amount of carbon we can release in the atmosphere is fixed. And because we've waited so long, emissions have continued to grow, and we've exhausted or nearly exhausted what we can. So now we have to reduce it with extremely high rates of decline, much higher, as you can see from those graphs, than if we had started in the 2000s. So the last slide is about precisely the frameworks that we've tried to put in place internationally to accompany, enable, force these changes in in global energy and CO2 emissions. So it all started in Rio in 1992 with the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there are two things to be kept in mind here. The first one is the objective to stabilize CO2 concentration at a safe level. And at the time, the science was not as developed as it is now. The other important thing which I've just mentioned is this concept of common but differentiated responsibility. So acknowledging that rich countries that are responsible for much of the cumulative growth in emissions in the past, because they've industrialized earlier, they should start to decline earlier. And that, I think, is probably no longer relevant because we've got so little time to do it. In Kyoto, a protocol to the Rio Convention was signed, and that was a key milestone. And this really was a very serious treaty, which was based on the idea that we allocate among nations a global carbon budget. And we started to, so Kyoto did this first for the rich countries, so it was supposed to go period by period for a first period of a few years. And then from 2012 onwards, following another negotiation, the scope should be expanded to the whole world. And this is what failed. And Kyoto was buried in another conference in Copenhagen in 2009, where basically the US on the one hand and China on the other hand ended up acknowledging that they would never find a mutually agreeable formula to extend Kyoto to the world. And therefore they committed to finding another way of approaching the problem, which they very briefly sketched in Copenhagen, but then was formalized in the years later. And in 2015, the famous Paris Agreement was signed, which restates the ambitious goal of keeping climate change within the 2-degree boundary, and if possible, 1.5 degree. I've shown you what it means in terms of carbon budget, the previous slide. However, we are supposed to get there by voluntary national commitments as opposed to binding quantitative targets like was the case at Kyoto. So this is based on voluntary commitments, which with a kind of international oversight to try and trigger a kind of race to the top, or at least emulation between countries. We're now 2021. It's been 5-6 years, and I will not be too definitive on what we've achieved so far within Paris, but let's say that the concept is probably not proven yet. But that's what we have now. That's what we're going to work with in the coming years. And with that said, I am done with my presentation, and hopefully we can engage with you guys when Laszlo will have broadened the scope of our knowledge and thinking.
Pierre, thank you very much for that really fascinating overview, and I hope it's helpful to students who are coming to this issue new. We have lots of resources at our Center on Global Energy Policy if we're getting up to speed on these issues. If you're interested in them, I just urge you to go to our website and look at the many reports that we've published on these topics. And of course, there's some great courses at Columbia that cover much of this material as well. One statistic that Pierre offered that will stick with me is that nearly 100% of the emissions growth in recent years has come out of emerging Asia. That just highlights the dynamism of the Asian economy, but also the extent to which the Asian economy is dependent on fossil fuels at this point. And now I'm delighted to turn it over to Laszlo Varro, the Chief Economist of the IEA. Laszlo, the floor is yours.
So, ladies and gentlemen, every year the International Energy Agency conducts an exercise of preparing a new world energy outlook, where we try to map the possible futures, and it's plural because only God knows the definite future. Us human beings, we can only create scenarios and try to map the possibilities for the energy system. And when you try to discuss the future of the energy system, unavoidably you have to take assumptions on government policy, because roughly 70% of the total investment in the energy sector is driven by government policy one way or the other. So we are transparent about the assumptions. One exercise that we do every year is what we call the stated energy policy scenario, which I could call it the don't shoot the messenger scenario, because there we are essentially holding up a mirror towards the political decision makers, that this is where your decisions are taking the energy system. And under the currently stated policies, with a bit of a simplification in the global economy, we have enough innovation, enough clean energy deployment, enough efficiency improvements to compensate for population growth, GDP growth, urbanization, and industrialization in emerging economies, keeping global carbon dioxide emissions more or less constant, which basically is equivalent to say that the planet is drifting towards a disruptive 3 degrees plus warming. Now, in the past couple of months, there has been an increasing interest, of course, in getting to net zero in line with the Paris Agreement. That's the Sustainable Development Scenario, we label it as DS, which involves a rapid decline of carbon dioxide emissions converging to net zero in the second half of the century. How do we plug this gap? Well, several European countries, but also New Zealand and some other advanced economies made net zero commitments in the past couple of months. The bad news is that the countries which made net zero commitments already had their carbon dioxide emissions declining rapidly. Whether the carbon dioxide emissions of Sweden declined by 85% or by 95%, that mathematically doesn't make a lot of difference. So the blue line is all the main primary European countries who made net zero commitments. Last fall, a very important announcement was made in the United Nations by President Xi Jinping, who committed China to achieving a 2060 net zero economy. Given that China has a very large and very carbon-intensive energy system, the Chinese net zero commitment is bigger in terms of its global climate impact than all the other primary European countries together. There is still a big gap. A significant proportion of this gap is the United States, because when we did the modeling and analysis, the United States was still having an election campaign, so we are not sure which direction the policy environment will go. We expect the Biden administration to put in place a very robust climate commitment in the foreseeable future. But of course, if you want to go for net zero in 2050, you have to have an even more accelerated emission reduction pattern. In fact, for a net zero in 2050 trajectory, global carbon dioxide emissions would need to continue to decline roughly with the same speed as they did in 2020. And of course, next time we would want to achieve that without shutting down the global economy. Now, that very little blue arrow, which you can hardly see, is the impact of the coronavirus crisis. So hundreds of thousands of people died, millions of people lost their jobs. The world economy experienced an unprecedented shock, but even that unprecedented shock was insufficient to eliminate global carbon dioxide emissions. Now, there have been a lot of discussions of how the epidemic changed our world. A couple of years ago, we might have met personally at the Columbia University of campus. I had the pleasure to visit the Columbia University campus before the epidemic several times. I'm looking forward to going back. This time we talk on Zoom. And certainly we see video conferencing replacing physical travel, but we also see people abandoning public transport as they are afraid of infections. We see people working from home, not commuting by car, but we also see that when they commute, when they work from home, they heat their homes warmer, they use air conditioning in the summer, And of course, the energy consumption of the digital economy is running flat out. So overall, when we crunched the numbers for the different social and behavioral changes, we came to the conclusion that they cut in both directions, and the net impact is very small. So the epidemic certainly changes the world in important aspects, but all those changes, some of them increase emissions, some of them cut emissions, and overall, they don't get us much closer to a sustainable pathway. Now, all around in the emerging world, definitely also in Asia, electricity demand growth is the most important energy phenomenon. So in a typical society, let it be in Africa or in developing Asia or Latin America, first, people leave their villages, work in a factory, use electric machine tools, buy electric appliances. This urbanization and industrialization eventually creates a middle class, and that middle class will eventually buy a car. So you could see, for example, that Chinese oil consumption is still significantly lower than the oil consumption of the United States, but Chinese electricity consumption bypassed American electricity consumption almost 10 years ago, and now it's almost twice as high as in the United States. So the growth of electricity is what is an extremely important driver. Now, among the major emerging economies, China has a very impressive electric car fleet, and China also uses electricity for heating by heat pumps. But in all other emerging economies, including in India, you don't need winter heating. And also in all other emerging economies outside China, electric cars are in a very, very early stage. So the three big drivers of electricity consumption are industrial motor systems, all the manufacturing outsourcing which took place to Asia, air conditioning. The center of gravity of the world economy is shifting to hot climates, and also major appliances. So we should not forget that the countries, including India, have made a fantastic progress in providing electricity access, and this is a major achievement. But there are still over 500 million people in India who have electricity for lighting and charging a mobile phone, but they don't yet own a refrigerator, and they don't yet own a washing machine. So the spread of major household appliances, the washing machines, the refrigerators, the microwave ovens, the televisions, all across primarily to the countryside, will create a very, very robust growth of electricity consumption. Now, as of today, the most important source of all this electricity all across Asia is coal. In fact, there were so many coal-fired power plants built in Asia in the past decade that there are around 600 large coal-fired power plants scattered across Asia, which are younger than 10 years old. Now, in this respect, we see China having a very different position than the rest of Asia, because China now has a very high per capita electricity consumption. With improving energy efficiency and the robust deployment of renewables, we see Chinese coal demand in a structural decline. But in the case of India, in the case of Southeast Asia, under the currently stated policies, we still see a future growth for coal. One very important debate in the context of the climate commitments is the role and the future of natural gas. Natural gas has a lower carbon intensity than coal. It's much better from a local air pollution point of view, but it is not a low carbon energy resource. It's a medium carbon energy resource. Under the stated policies, we see a robust future for natural gas. We see an important role switching from coal to natural gas, primarily in Asia. We see an increasing growth, primarily in industrial energy consumption. Of course, improving energy efficiency and renewables will cut gas demand, but overall, it's still a robust growth. But these are the stated policies which lead to a disruptive 3 degrees warming. So once we go to a Paris Agreement compliant well below 2 degrees trajectory, the picture changes for natural gas. Namely, there is still a role to switch from coal to gas. That's a very important contribution. Half of the growth in industry would have to come from facilities retrofitted with carbon capture and storage. As of today, the number of natural gas using facilities in the entire world economy which use carbon capture and storage is, I should know the exact number, but it's around 25. So less than 30. And that will have to be scaled up at a really large scale. And of course, in a low carbon trajectory, there is a very large scale switching from natural gas to renewables, and also energy efficiency improvements we also have to accelerate. Now, of course, as we put coal to a structural decline, and as we also use gas only as a bridge fuel in a limited extent, something will have to plug the gap. And of course, that something is wind and solar. This wind and solar experienced a genuine technological revolution in the past decade. And that technological revolution is our best hope to tackle climate change. And I should highlight that, especially in the case of solar, China played an absolutely indispensable role in furthering that technological revolution. As of today, around 2/3 of the solar panels globally are manufactured in China. But I should also highlight that in the past 5 years, India implemented a comprehensive set of policies to kickstart solar. So the currently unfolding solar revolution in India is not only a technological success, it is also a policy and regulatory success which required improved financing, improved land use access, improved grid operations. A comprehensive set of issues had to be addressed by the Indian government, which they did very successfully. But what we have seen so far from wind and solar is only a taste of things to come of what will be needed, because a further step change will be needed in deployment and integration of wind and solar production. Now, it's not enough to only put in the new sources. We also have to deal with the legacy of the high carbon past, because if I look at all the existing facilities, the power plants, the steel mills, the cement factories, if I operate those facilities through their optimal tactical lifetime, the already existing facilities already lock in a 1.65 degrees warming. So if we want to have a seriously pursued 1.5 degree target, we will have to deal with the emissions locked in into the existing infrastructure. And that would mean retrofitting existing facilities with carbon capture and storage, converting existing facilities from coal to hydrogen, and other innovative technologies. And of course, given the massive scale investment wave in Asia in the past 20 years, the majority of this lock-in problem is in Asia, and around half of it is specifically in China. Now, together with the International Monetary Fund, we work together how to use this crisis as an opportunity, because the economy is in a recession. Governments are prepared to spend really significant amounts of money. This is exactly a situation where during the Great Depression, Keynes, the great economist, recommended that governments should pay people to dig holes and the government should pay other people to fill up the holes, just to keep the economy going. Now, instead of paying people to dig a hole and paying other people to fill up the hole, we will pay the other people to put a wind turbine into the hole or put an electric car charger into the hole. The energy system will have to move to a more capital intensive direction. We have to invest more for the energy transition. But as major central banks reacted to the coronavirus crisis with an unprecedented monetary expansion, capital is very cheap. So consequently, we designed together with the IMF a sustainable recovery plan to boost the economy, to create jobs and improve energy resilience and sustainability. This is basically a 3-year, $1 trillion per year investment effort, with 3 big pillars: improving energy efficiency, transforming the electricity sector primarily with renewables, and also a broad set of innovative new technologies, including hydrogen, carbon capture and storage. So we think that there are, of course, non-trivial institutional and political barriers, but the macroeconomic and energy opportunity is huge. And this is one of the core focus of the IEA's work together with both China and India. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Laszlo. And if there's one statistic I'm going to remember from your wide-ranging presentation, it is that there are 600 coal-fired power plants in Asia that are younger than 10 years old. That has very significant implications for the climate change challenge going forward. Let me invite anyone in the audience to submit a question through the Q&A function. Be delighted to pose them to our two experts. While you do that, let me just start by talking about the transition ahead and focus on where you were just ending, Laszlo, which is on renewables in emerging Asia, because I think that may be of great interest to some people in the audience. And I wonder, from each of you, maybe starting with Laszlo and then going to Pierre, how you see renewables growth developing in Asia in the years ahead. And that would be solar, wind, and also hydropower.
So in this respect, I think we need to make a distinction between China on one hand and India and Southeast Asia on the other hand. And the reason for this is the geography of the countries. So in China, the large majority of the population lives in the eastern and coastal regions of the country, which has very high urbanization, very high population density, similar to India and similar to Indonesia or Vietnam or Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. But in China, you also have huge sparsely inhabited territories, essentially the western and northwestern China, so Inner Mongolia, Qinghai, Gansu, Xinjiang provinces, where there are massive territories available, which are very windy, very sunny, plenty of space. So in the case of China, there are extremely large-scale developments in those provinces, and of course the big challenge that China had to tackle is nobody lives there, and there's no energy demand. So China has been building a very impressive heavy-duty, long-distance direct current transmission system, delivering massive amounts of electricity, wind power from Gansu, hydropower from Yunnan towards the eastern provinces. Now, this has been a very successful strategy, but this is quite unique to China. Whereas in the case of India and Southeast Asia, the relative importance of solar is much higher. Of course, China has been heavily investing into solar. It is the biggest solar investor in the world. But within China, wind power is bigger than solar. But in India and in Southeast Asia, because of the monsoon, you have substantial periods of the year when wind is underperforming. So solar is the number one renewable resource. India has been very successful ramping up solar. Solar requires different approaches. All around Southeast Asia and also in India, you can have periods when the sun goes down at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, but it's still awfully hot and humid, and air conditioning is running flat out. So consequently, you need to have a sizable storage deployment. And so our expectation is that in India, in Southeast Asia, solar plus storage projects are going to be the key drivers of renewables. Whereas in the case of China, our expectation is that China will be able to capitalize of the unique natural resources of its western provinces.
Thank you for that great answer. And maybe let's have a talk about kind of different fuel types. And Pierre, turn to you on natural gas, which is, I know you're one of the leading experts in the world on natural gas markets. And in Asia, how do you see natural gas markets growing in the years ahead, and what impact do you think that will have on the climate challenge?
I think on basically every topic we're going to look at, we will have to differentiate China, at least China and the rest of Asia. And as Laszlo's just done, perhaps even China, India, and the rest of Asia. But on natural gas, it's absolutely true. The numbers are so big in China that even a minor, if you want, progress or decline in the share of energy that's covered by natural gas makes a very big difference on Asian and therefore global traded gas markets. And we've seen that in the past 5-6 years. What we're going to see in the future, I don't know, but the past 5-6 years, the growth in China was driven by a very effective public policy drive to clean up the air in big Chinese cities. And so a lot of coal was displaced by natural gas, not necessarily in power, but more in heavy industry and heating. And that generated an extremely large growth, not only in consumption, but in Chinese imports, and therefore was the main driver of the international LNG, liquefied natural gas market. In Southeast Asia, you have a very interesting and slightly more worrying trend, which is that you've got a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that are very gasified, where gas covers a relatively high share of primary energy. But this is because they had a lot of domestic gas, which they could feed into the economy at cheap prices. And this domestic gas has plateaued, and in many of those countries is actually declining. So they face, or they had been facing, because it's been going on for a number of years now, a choice between transitioning to imported gas, which would be LNG, or moving back to coal. And because of simply cost comparisons, because coal being across the cycle so much cheaper than LNG, at least for power generation, coal has had a big comeback in Southeast Asia. So you see a lot of gas being actually displaced in Southeast Asia. Gas is losing ground. And the picture is essentially the same in India as Southeast Asia. Gas is having a very hard time in the power sector in India, and the hopes of the gas industry are more into the industrial sector. But actually, if you look at industry in details in India, apart from the segments where gas is heavily subsidized, such as fertilizers, gas consumption gas is competing head-on with much more polluting fuels. And because of problems in the enforcement of environmental standards and air pollution standards, gas is having a hard time penetrating industry where it's not subsidized. So the picture is contrasted, but in power, there's the threat of coal on the one hand, and now the threat of cheaper and cheaper renewables on the other hand. And outside of power, usually gas needs public support if it is to compete with more polluting fuels. And China has provided, actually, on a very large scale, this public support, which explains what I've described.
Well, thank you. And we're down to about our last 5 minutes, but I wanted to touch on two topics at least before we go. So one is oil demand in Asia, and both in the short and long term. Oil prices are trending up today, or in the past several months, higher than they've been in several years. And I wonder, Laszlo, what you see for the short and long-term oil demand picture in Asia. And then before we go, I'd like to ask either of you to talk about nuclear power, which we haven't mentioned yet, and how you see the nuclear power growing or not in Asia. But Laszlo, any quick thoughts on oil demand?
Sure. China became a quite comprehensively motorized society with a very large car market. And China is also a country which is the global leader in transport electrification. And it's very clear that in China, transport electrification has multiple drivers. One of them is the energy transition, but another one is the policy concerns about increasing oil imports. And China is actually the first country where electric cars, and also I should highlight electric buses, which are very important in the Chinese public transport systems. Electric cars and electric buses now have a meaningful impact on Chinese oil demand. And of course, the biggest by far is the Chinese high-speed train system. The Chinese high-speed train system is equivalent of around 600,000 barrels per day jet fuel not being burned in domestic aviation. The construction of the high-speed train system in China has been actually the biggest structural shift in the transport system anywhere in the world economy in the past decade. Having said that, China still has millions and millions of conventional cars. So we do expect a peak in Chinese oil demand, but how far in the future this peak is, and how rapid the decline will be after the peak, that will be very strongly influenced by the implementation of President Xi's 2060 net zero commitment. Now, in the case of India, one thing we have to keep in mind is that the Indian economy has a vulnerability to high oil prices. So oil imports is the biggest import item in the Indian balance of payments by far. And the Indian economy has been traditionally have been challenges with the current account deficit. So India is one of the countries where a sudden increase of high oil prices can have growth implications. In India, a personal passenger car is still a bit of a luxury. So only the top couple of % of society has passenger cars. But the Indian economy, of course, relies very strongly on trucking. So the economic spillovers are quite significant. On nuclear, both China and India are resolutely pro-nuclear at the political level, and of course, nuclear is a technology for which you have to have a strong top-down political commitment. And both countries have a nuclear new build program, and in both countries, it is the combination of buying foreign technology. So, for example, there are Russian nuclear power plants being built in India. China had both Russian and also American technology and French technology, the EPRs built in China, and also efforts to develop the domestic nuclear industry. So both countries have a domestic nuclear technology program as well. Having said that, it's fair to say that the Chinese nuclear program is significantly bigger. So India is building new nuclear power plants, and nuclear will play a role in India. But the Chinese nuclear program is something which really has a global significance. And in fact, China is now very easily on track to bypass the United States as the greatest producer of nuclear energy in the foreseeable future.
Well, Pierre, we are just about out of time, but first, thank you for all your work in organizing this series, and any final words before we go?
No, Laszlo said most of what needed to be said about nuclear. Just a footnote, perhaps. There are 3 mature nuclear programs in Asia. Japan, which was one of the largest in the world, South Korea, and Taiwan, province of China, or Taiwan. I'm not going to take a position here. But the 3 of those are in deep crisis. And I think it's very interesting because China is an exception globally. Nuclear is having a very hard time, actually, almost everywhere, for 2 reasons. One is that it's become extremely expensive, even in an environment where capital is very cheap, because capital is also cheap for renewables. Nuclear has become very expensive essentially because of accidents, which has translated into additional regulatory, safety burdens on the engineering designs. But also, as countries progress in their, socially and economically, there's a trend that we see everywhere, that nuclear becomes rejected politically or less and less accepted by public opinion. And this has manifested itself in the West. It's now totally the case in both South Korea and Taiwan, where a deep legitimacy crisis for the nuclear program. And of course, in in Japan, after Fukushima, the government and the entire bureaucracy is adamant that it should and will restart the nuclear power plants, but actually there's very, very strong public opposition to that. So I think these aspects needed perhaps to be added as a footnote to what Laszlo said.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to both of you for these really extraordinary presentations. And this seminar series will continue. The next one will be in April at a exact date and time to be announced. Thanks to everybody who joined us. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next seminar. Thanks so much to Pierre, Noël, and Laszlo Varro. Thank you, everybody.